the styrofoam insert from that box of dummies here in evidence, and the reason that we gave it to you so that you can actually look at it in real time and not look at a photograph is because it's kind of dirty and gross. It kind of fits exactly the way that she described it. But there are some characteristics of this styrofoam insert that are going to become more important. Any suggestion by the defense that somehow the box of dummy rounds that Ms. Gutierrez said she was pulling from was swapped out with something different is absolute nonsense. First of all, you know that because you can see the live rounds. If you don't think you can see them on the 10th, and you don't think you can see them on the 13th, and you don't think you can see them on the 15th, you know you're looking at one on the 17th and 18th. You know you are. So where does the sabotage theory go then? The 17th and 18th, the camera crew hadn't quit yet. Mr. Norvell wasn't on set poking around on the prop cart. Mr. Halls hadn't had an opportunity to spend any time with the gun. They moved directly from that cart right into Lieutenant Benavidez's patrol unit. They go from that patrol unit right into evidence at the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department. And on November 9th of 2021, Hannah Gutierrez shows Detective Hancock, now Corporal Hancock, the box of dummies that she and her dad have. And if you listen to Mr. Kenny's testimony, what you understand is that the ammunition from the previous set, that being the old way, Hannah brought leftover dummies from that movie onto the set of Rust. And those 45 long Colt dummy rounds were provided by Thel Reed. What you are looking at in this photo is this styrofoam insert. This is the styrofoam insert that had the live round in it. This is the styrofoam insert that came out of the box labeled 45 long Colt dummies with the JS in the middle. Now, let's put it together. Our original evidence photo up here from October 10th, you can see this distinct sort of cut in the styrofoam on that insert that is sitting on her leg on the 10th. You can see that the hole in the styrofoam in the second to the right at the top is dirty. You can see a little bit of grime. You can see it right there. And you're going to take it into evidence and you can look at it closer. You're going to see that there's some damage to the styrofoam separators between these two holes. And what do you know? It's right there. There's a little bit of damage to the styrofoam separators down here. You can see it in the photo on the right. You can look for yourself. It is right here. And what do you know? That silver primered round from October 10th is sitting in the exact same position that it was found on October 21st when the Sheriff's Department collected this box, took it into evidence, and photographed it. Ladies and gentlemen, we call that circumstantial evidence, but that's a mountain of circumstantial evidence. Prop assistant duties versus armorer duties on October 21st of 2021. Let's focus on that day. And listen, I'm not here to tell you that Rust Productions did the right thing when they hired on a part-time armorer and asked her to also spend her time doing props. I think everybody who has testified has said that was a really bad idea, and that's probably part of the reason that they're being sued by a whole bunch of different people. But on October 21st, this was simply not the case. It was not the case on that day. She had 3 hours in the morning waiting for the camera crew to arrive. She had every opportunity to go through that box of dummies, that only had like 30 rounds in it. How long does it take to pull the round out of the box, shake it, and if it doesn't shake, look to see if it has a hole in it, put it back in the box, and do that to each and every one of them? How long does that exercise take? 10 minutes max? That's not hard. The other thing that is very important is Ms. Gutierrez didn't get pulled out of the church because she had to go focus on prop duties. She left the gun in the church contrary to all the industry standards for armorers on movie sets, for firearm safety on movie sets, and she went back out to her cart so that she could start doing other armorer duties. She's getting her fanny pack filled up. Well, we've seen that. She's filling it with blanks. And we know they're about to do a turnaround. They're going to do this quick insert with Baldwin, and then they're going to do the shoot scene, the gunfire scene where they're using blanks, and the law enforcement have come into the church and there's a shootout. So she goes to get ready for it. She just leaves the gun in there. As you heard from many witnesses, she would leave guns unattended all the time. There was nothing unusual about October 21st that caused her to be unable to stay in the church to properly perform her duties. She leaves the gun. She goes back out because, for some reason, with the 3 hours of free time that she had in the morning, she didn't get her fanny pack filled up. She didn't get herself ready for that turnaround, so she leaves the gun. Everybody's heard, armorers don't leave the gun. Now, let's move over to our tampering with evidence charge. How is getting rid of a bag of cocaine tampering with evidence related to involuntary manslaughter? Well, on October 21st, 2021, the shooting occurs, the incident occurs. Ms. Gutierrez understands that someone has been seriously injured. She does not yet know that that person is not going to live or has already died. She gets interviewed at the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office. I will say, surprisingly, 2 occasions after this incident where a helicopter had to come in, ambulances had to come in, Ms. Gutierrez, on 2 occasions after that incident, spoke about her concerns about her career. Wow. That gives you an idea that you are dealing with someone who is not particularly concerned about the health and safety of others. And her job was to be concerned about the health and safety of others. But on that day, she's just thinking about herself. She's put a lady in the hospital, a man in the hospital. She asks to be escorted to the bathroom. Corporal Hancock agrees to do that, and we have her on video on the way there expressing dismay about how this will affect her career. Ouch. After the interview, Hannah goes back to her hotel. Rebecca Smith goes to Hannah's room. She's been summoned by some other folks to try to sort of sit and visit and give Hannah some support. So Rebecca Smith goes to her room, and Rebecca Smith is the person that tells Hannah that Helena Hutchins has now died. And you have to understand, in the mind of Hannah Gutierrez, this investigation went from this big to this big. Because the difference between shooting someone and them living and shooting someone and them dying is a really, really big difference. So she is told by Rebecca Smith, investigation just got giant and very, very serious. So after receiving that information, she offloads this bag of cocaine to Rebecca Smith. Rebecca Smith is a lady that's lived a life. She's used cocaine before, many years previous, but she's used cocaine. She knows what it looks like. She knows how it's packaged. And because she's a former addict, she tosses it in a trash can. When Mr. Bowles gets up here and says, I can't prove to you that it's cocaine, remember that when people destroy evidence to avoid prosecution, you don't have the evidence that they destroyed. They got rid of it. So I don't have to prove to you by some scientific drug test. I don't have to send that to the lab and get it tested. It's gone. That's the point to the charge. Now, let me digress a little bit and run through a couple of things with you. What's all this testimony about this inertia puller? And how does that play into everything? Well, as you heard from Mr. Haig, an inertia puller is a device designed for one task. It disassembles live rounds. That's what it does. Somehow I think the defense got confused about what our potential theory was, that we had a theory that Ms. Gutierrez was turning dummy rounds into live rounds. That was never our theory, because that would require quite a bit of equipment. There's no question. But to do the reverse is a whole lot easier. So if you're out of dummy rounds or you're running low on dummy rounds and you've got some live rounds around, you could probably turn a you could turn a live round into a dummy round in 5 minutes. Why does an armor on a movie set bill for an inertia puller? Well, obviously she had one. Now, let's talk about the OSHA investigation. OSHA doesn't find any wrongdoing with individual employees, only employers. That's their job. They're just an agency that maintains workplace safety. Mr. Genoway confirmed when he was on the witness stand, it's true his memory was a little bad and Mr. Lewis had to refresh it for him, but he confirmed that Hannah's conduct on the set contributed to their findings that this was not a safe workplace. Please keep in mind that the OSHA investigation is not a criminal investigation. Critically and surprisingly, OSHA never interviewed Gabrielle Pickle. This is critically important because if they had interviewed her, they would have known the following things. Hannah was granted 10 armorer days out of the 12 filming days, not 8. That was right there in the cell phone records. The training days, when Ms. Gutierrez is sending those messages saying, I want more training time, training days. She's not saying these actors, these adults, need more training time. She specifically requested additional training time to train the child, and it was refused because, first of all, it's a major liability issue, and second of all, the child was never going to fire a gun. So when she asked for the additional training days, they were denied. That's not the reason Helena Hutchins is dead. Keep in mind, Gabrielle Pickle had a meeting with Hannah and offered her additional assistance so that she would be able to perform her duties effectively. She offered assistance from some of the other folks there on set to try to give her some relief. And keep in mind that on a movie set, the armorer has autonomy with regard to gun safety. The OSHA finding that Rust Productions failed to properly supervise her is surprisingly incorrect, because the armorer has no supervisor when it comes to weapons and gun safety on the movie set. Mr. Halls is just there to be a second pair of eyes. That's it. Now, I think there can be no question that Rust Productions was more than negligent when they hired Ms. Gutierrez, because she was not anywhere close to being qualified for this job. In fact, if you recall, Gabrielle Pickle, to her credit, tried to get Ms. Gutierrez to implement a check-in and check-out system because 2 people had complained that there was a shotgun left unattended. People on the set were complaining about her. They went to production and said, hey, she's not supposed to do that. You can't just leave real guns laying around. So Gabrielle Pickle goes to Hannah Gutierrez, asks for a check-in, check-out system. Hannah Gutierrez says no. Hannah Gutierrez says it's too difficult, it's too much trouble. Gabrielle Pickle didn't prevent her from being safe. In that instance, she did the opposite. She tried to improve firearm safety on the set, but keep in mind, the armorer has autonomy. So Gabrielle Pickle is not Hannah Gutierrez's boss when it comes to firearm safety. Ms. Gutierrez gets to do what she wants. Now, I can only imagine that after this chain of cases, all of that will change. So, the defense has taken a shotgun approach to this case. Seth Kinney is to blame. Well, no evidence of that. Sarah Zachary is to blame. No evidence of that. Dave Halls is to blame. He shouldn't have taken the gun from her. And he didn't do a good safety check. Well, she is the autonomous decision maker with regard to gun safety. It's not that Dave Halls shouldn't have taken the gun from her, it's that she shouldn't have given him the gun and then turned around and walked away. The defense. Alec Baldwin is to blame for acting like a prima donna on the movie set and bossing people around. This is Hollywood, for heaven's sakes. I would imagine that's relatively common. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that his conduct was right. I am the person who indicted him. Alec Baldwin's conduct and his lack of gun safety inside that church on that day is something that he's going to have to answer for. Not with you and not today. That'll be with another jury on another day. Brian Norvell, the gentleman who goes and gets the prop cart and wheels it over and then puts his hand over the crime scene tape and picks up that dummy round and shakes it. You heard Mr. Bowles ask some questions that are intended to make people think that Mr. Norvell either took something off the prop cart or planted something on the prop cart. Well, keep in mind, He doesn't have to plant live rounds because we've seen from the photographic evidence, those are there. They're floating around already. So live rounds were on set. They were not planted by Brian Norvell. But this man is not a mystery to the state or the defense. I made him come in and sit down for a 1.5-hour interview so that the defense could ask him any questions they wanted, and they asked him none. Not a single question. So what that means is that this is just all smoke and mirrors and deflection. They don't want the truth. We know the truth. You have seen it throughout this trial. And I will remind you that during one of the heated objection exchanges between myself and Mr. Bowles, you heard Mr. Bowles cry out that he was looking for the truth. Listen, I can bring a horse to water, but I cannot make him drink. If you want the truth, I'll bring the guy in. I'll make him available for you to talk to. Ask him some questions. Not a single one. It must have been that disgruntled camera crew. You mean the people who believed that safety on set was being compromised to such a degree that they left? That decision may very well have saved their lives. So, the $60,000 question in this case, who brought the live rounds on set? You know the answer to that. I know the answer to that. I'm not telling you that Hannah Gutierrez intended to bring live rounds on set. I'm telling you that she was negligent, she was careless, she was thoughtless. She brought them on set, and you know from the testimony you heard, Sarah Zachary never saw her shake a dummy round. Dave Halls never saw her shake a dummy round. She didn't shake those dummy rounds. For all we know, those dummy rounds were floating around the set of The Old Way, and Nicolas Cage is lucky to have walked away with his life. So why does it matter that she brought live rounds on set? It goes to foreseeability. She had six live rounds on that movie set. The earliest date that I can track them for you is October 10th. We know that they were there from the 10th to the 21st. 6, and she failed to ferret them out for 12 days. What that means is that she wasn't shaking any dummy rounds. She wasn't testing anything. None of that stuff that her lawyers want you to think was so difficult. None of it was happening. It didn't happen the entire time. She didn't find any of them. And folks, if she's not checking the dummy ammunition during the pendency of the filming to make sure that those rounds that are designed to look like live rounds are in fact dummy rounds, this was a game of Russian roulette every time an actor had a gun with dummies. Sadly for Ms. Hutchins, her camera crew walked off set that morning, and that required her to go into the church and operate the camera herself.
Double up and save. Earn double Alec points on Juvederm when you get treated with Botox Cosmetic and Juvederm filler at the same visit. Book now.
That Ms. Gutierrez put in Mr. Baldwin's gun was expelled from that firearm and went all the way through her body. No one told Ms. Gutierrez to leave the church. No one called her out of the church. There wasn't a COVID protocol in place that prevented her from being in the church at that moment. You know from the production outfitter videos, she didn't care about her job. She let it all go. Mr. Bowles is going to argue to you that if Mr. Halls had just called Ms. Gutierrez back into the church, she would have done an additional safety check, and that live round would have been found. Well, for heaven's sakes. We all know that if she had been called back into the church for an additional safety check, nothing would have changed. Her safety checks didn't consist of pulling the dummy rounds out of the cylinder, shaking them in front of the actor and the assistant director, showing them that they're dummy rounds, and putting them back in. No one ever saw her do that one single time, even though that's industry standard. And the reason it's industry standard is because you can't tell a dummy round by simply spinning a cylinder and looking at the primers unless they are dummy rounds without primers. And that's kind of an interesting fact. We know that 6 dummy rounds without primers were not loaded into that weapon because one of them turned out to be live and very clearly had a primer. Interestingly, though, she had 5 dummy rounds without primers in her pocket. In her pocket. All she had to do was put those in the gun, make sure that the 6th one either rattles or has a hole in it, and she's good to go. Because now, when you look, when the cylinder gets spun, you can see 5 of them without taking them out, that they don't have primers. They were in her pocket, and she didn't use them. I am going to have another opportunity to speak with you, and when I speak with you last, it won't be as long, I promise. And we will talk about some of our jury instructions then. But I do want to address some of the testimony from Dr. Gerald from OMI, because Mr. Bowles is likely to make an argument that there was some sort of medical negligence that contributed to Ms. Hutchins' death. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Dr. Gerald's testimony. Here are the lethal injuries. The lethal injuries. Blood loss from the wound. That was the primary lethal injury. Her blood was leaking into her abdominal cavity, and a lot of it. And you saw those photographs. You saw the photographs of her clothing. There was a lot of blood. So the first lethal injury that comes from the gunshot is blood loss associated with it. And the second one, if you recall from Dr. Gerald, the wound to the lung was also a lethal wound. Keep in mind, that bullet went into her body, it went through her rib, it severed her spinal cord, it punctured her lung, it came out the back of her shoulder, and a few hours later, Ms. Gutierrez is telling Corporal Hancock that she's worried about her career. If you think that person would have done a satisfactory safety check if she had been called back to the church, I am here to tell you that I strongly disagree. The astonishing lack of diligence with regard to gun safety is, without question, a significant cause of the death of Helena Hutchins. Did Mr. Baldwin also contribute when he pointed the gun at people and pulled the hammer back, and regardless of what he said to George Stephanopoulos, pulled the trigger? Yes, he is. And again, we'll deal with that another time. You don't escape accountability when you load a live round into a prop gun, tell the crew that it has dummy rounds in it, hand it off to an actor, and leave the room because he manipulated it. That's the whole point. That was the whole point to him having it. Of course he was going to manipulate it. It's foreseeable. Everything is so completely foreseeable. Imagine I hand you a gun and I tell you that it's basically empty and I walk away when in fact I put live ammunition in it. You think an accident might happen? You think that accident is foreseeable? And listen, let's remember some of the testimony from Mr. Carpenter. Control is how we enforce gun safety. We do it with control. When she loses control, which she did repeatedly, anything goes. Anything goes there. I am going to complete the majority of the portion of my closing arguments with regard to the facts. The next portion will be with regard to the law. When I come back after Mr. Bowles has had an opportunity to address you, we will be asking for justice today for Helena Hutchins. Thank you.
Now, may we approach?
If it's about a bathroom break, we're going to take a bathroom break.
Okay.
Okay. So please don't talk among yourselves or anyone else about the evidence received here in court. Thank you. We'll be back at 10 of. Okay?
Hey everybody, Law and Crime's Jesse Weber here. Thank you so much for watching our coverage of the Rust trial of Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. You know, this case makes me think about how people get hurt in all kinds of situations that should not happen. And if you do get injured, it is so important to know your rights and whether you should be compensated. That's why I want to highlight the official sponsor of this week's live trial coverage, Morgan & Morgan. They are actually the largest injury law firm in the whole country. And if you're going to take on big insurance companies that often lowball insurance offers in these cases, you need a big firm that's willing to fight. I mean, in the past couple of months, Morgan & Morgan saw verdicts of $12 million in Florida, $6.8 million in New York, and $26 million in Philadelphia. Now, mind you, these are all considerably higher than the highest insurance offers for these accidents. But what also makes Morgan & Morgan so special is that they have completely modernized the process for their clients. They make it super easy because you submit your claim, you upload documents, you talk to your whole legal team, all on your smartphone. That's it. You can see if you have a case in just a few minutes. And in terms of price, you only pay them if you win. There's no upfront fee. Maybe it's not that surprising that 3 million people call them every year. So if you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without even having to leave your couch. To start your claim, visit forthepeople.com/lawandcrimelive.
recognize the items in the box?
Yes.
Your Honor, if we could mark this collectively as the next exhibit.
Mark the box and its contents is number 27.
Let me hand you exhibit 27, and what I want you to do is I want you to take each item out and show it to the jury, and then if you can walk the items down in front of the jury and explain what they're.
Make sure the firearms clear.
Yes, sir. Firearms clear, sir.
And if you want to set things down on this table, that's fine too. You close enough to the jury that they should be able to hear you, so just speak as loud as you can, and we'll push you on the mic too.
So this is the firearm as it was found on scene. This is a normal semi-automatic firearm made by Taurus, Millennium G2 P111. Very popular weapon. It was found under the bush outside. The magazine from the weapon, it has a little bit of tarnishing on it. That is due to the super glue fuming we do to try to get fingerprints off of it.
When this, are you the one that actually picked it up from the bush?
Yes, no one touched it before I touched it.
Okay. And where was the magazine whenever you first encountered the weapon?
The magazine was in the weapon.
Okay. And are there rounds in the magazine?
There were, yes, ma'am.
How many rounds were in the magazine?
The 4 live rounds still in the magazine.
Okay. What else did you know about that particular weapon when you first?
So it was, when I first came in contact with it, the weapon was in an operational, it was in battery is what we call it. The slide was forward, like so this gun is safe. The slide was forward and the magazine was in the weapon like this. I went to make the gun safe, removed the magazine so no live rounds go back into the chamber. I removed the magazine, I went to make the gun safe, and as I did, I noticed that there was a spent shell casing stuck inside the chamber. We call it a stovepipe. It was stuck inside the chamber. It was stuck in there, and so when I went to cycle, it wanted to fall through. I stopped and immediately took a photograph of it so that I could show that that was stuck in the chamber.
Okay. And so you used the word stovepipe. Can you explain to the jury what you mean when you use the word stovepipe?
So there's 2 different kind of, there's a failure to eject where the the casing fails to leave the chamber. Everybody sees a semi-automatic handgun. When you fire around, the slide cycles back and the spent casing gets shot out the side. It's called ejection. When it doesn't do that, it's called a fail to eject. When the round gets caught in here, you can kind of see the casing sticking out. It's a pipe. They call it a stovepipe. It's kind of shooting out the side.
And so when you encountered the weapon and picked it up off the ground or making it safe, that's when you noticed that there was a stovepipe, there was a casing.
There was a failure to eject. There was a casing still locked in the chamber. Yes, ma'am.
What other items do you have in that box?
So the weapon, the magazine, I have the spent casing that was recovered from the chamber. I have the 4 live rounds from the magazine, and I have the DNA swabs as collected off the weapon.
Okay, if you could open the spent casing.
Yeah, let me.
Change clothes.
You said the spent casing? So this is the spent casing. It fell asleep. This is the,
Just maybe hold that and walk down and show the jury.
so this is the spent casing. That's on. This is the spent casing. That's other. 9mm. Yes, 9mm, and you can see the primer was struck. That is what causes the bullets to be fired, projectiles to be fired from the shell casing.
So again, this is the one that was stuck in the weapon, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. As well.
There's two other jurors on the end.
Oh, I apologize.
And if you will put that back in here, and then if we can make this particular envelope 27A.
All right, file that as 27A, which will be the spent casing.
And then you said that there were also rounds in the magazine, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. There was.
Are they in an envelope as well?
They are. Yes, ma'am.
If you'll just show this to the jurors.
These are the live rounds that we recovered from the magazine weapon.
And there are 4 there, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
We can make this 27B. And I'm gonna let you go back and have a seat. I will bring Okay, you indicated that there were 2 additional things that you did.
Yes, ma'am.
on this as well. What was the first one that you did?
We collect DNA.
Okay, and so tell the jury about that, please.
So anytime we have a firearm, it's standard practice for us to collect DNA off of the weapon. If you look at the photograph that I had when I first put the firearm in the box, you can actually see the empty swab paper, the empty swab container, because before I ever touch it, just due to cross-contamination issues, I will swab first. So we get photographed in, I put new gloves on, I swab the firearm, and then I move in to make the firearm safe. So on a firearm, we will swab 3 places.
You had indicated something in this box. Where are you talking about?
So if you look at the top, kind of right, there's a white piece of paper there. That's the empty sheath that a set of swabs comes in, a sterile set of swabs.
And for the record, we're looking at Exhibit 26.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, go ahead.
So we collect, it'd be easier if I show you, but we collect DNA from 3 different places on the firearm. One is the trigger. That's obvious. These semi-automatic weapons, as I'll show you, have a trigger with a safety integral to the trigger itself. And that supposed to allow people who are not meaning to fire the gun to prevent them from firing the gun. But due to the firearm itself and the way the trigger is ribbed, we collect DNA from the trigger. We collect DNA from the grip, where there's a roughed surface that can grab finger cells. And we collect it from the slide right here as well. I'll walk around and show you. But we collect it from this slide as well, because these are very rough ridges providing grip when you pull back the gun. And the spring is kind of heavy, so they make them very aggressive. These areas collect the most DNA. So that's why we collect it from there. Should I show?
Sure.
Yeah. This root area here on the slide, this aggressive grip, and the trigger has parts of the trigger as well. The grip on the slide,
there's a microphone right there beside you.
So the ridges on the side of the slide, the aggressive grip material on the grip of the gun, and the ridges in the trigger itself.
And then you said you also did fingerprint swabs.
Yes, that's correct. That we did. It's called cyanoacrylate fuming, but it's super glue fuming.
We have to go back up there, just so you're more comfortable. Can you tell the jury about that?
Is there any question your client handled? No. Move along.
You also did fingerprint examination?
That's correct. We put it into a hood and we use the standard scientific practice where we fume super glue into the chamber. Any amino acids from the fingerprint will develop a fingerprint.
Okay. And so in this particular case, were you able to retrieve fingerprints from that gun?
No, ma'am.
And why is that?
It's incredibly hard. I would say maybe 5% of all firearms that I ever got had a fingerprint, and I think maybe one semi-automatic with these rough texture, the polymer grip, and the way that these are designed, they're actually designed to spread oil so they don't look as bad and get dirty as fast. So any oils and amino acids that are on the surface of the gun go away very quickly. And, yeah.
So you weren't able to retrieve any fingerprints in this case?
No, ma'am.
You will return those items to that box, and then you'll make that weapon safe. All right, so we were talking earlier about the different times when different things happen. And so I want to get let me hand you exhibits 26, 25, and 24.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm going to write while you. Okay, so what was the time that you told me that you initially arrived at the scene? I think you said 8:10. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right.
The time I took the first photo.
Okay.
But, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. So is 8:10 when you actually took the first photo?
No, ma'am. It was 9:10.
All right. And so explain to the jury where you got 8:10 and why it's actually 9:10.
So we're taught to testify as to the time of the metadata of the photo. So you can look at any photo, any digital photo you take, and find out when that photo was.
Serum, it's their #1 best-selling anti-aging serum, and once you try it, you
testify as to the metadata that comes with this original photograph. But I know from my notes and from my report that my camera was off 1 hour when I took those photos.
And why would your camera be off by an hour?
Most likely a daylight savings time issue. We take millions of photographs over 5-6 years, and sometimes you just forget to change the date and time.
So the first set of photos that you did that was of the initial crime scene was at 9:10. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And then the second set of photos that you did, starting with the remote, when did that start?
That would have been 10:10.
Okay, and the
And
next.
for the record, so we're talking about 24 is the first set, 25 is the second set.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yes, Your Honor. And then exhibit 26, whenever you all found the firearm, I believe you testified that you started taking photos almost immediately thereafter?
Yes, ma'am.
What time was that?
That was 11:05, 11:06.
11:05, 11:06, and that is the gun. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. After you took those initial photos on the scene, was there anywhere else? What's the next thing you did? After you took the 3 sets of photos we just talked about.
So during this time, it's somewhat chaotic, and we're trying to get as much evidence as we can and still meet the wishes of the investigators. And there's multiple investigators on scene, multiple officers. Around this time, once we had the gun, we're doing an in-depth search for evidence. It all has to fit into it's not a strict schedule, but we also would, around this time, once things are calming down, I'm looking to run my Faro scan, my laser scanner. I'm looking to do very in-depth search for extra evidence that wasn't found on the initial sweep, looking for anything else that we could have missed.
So at this point, you found the cartridge, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, we had already found that in the weapon.
But you've not found the projectile, is that
Correct. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Is the next thing, did you ever go to UT Hospital?
Right after this, I believe it was Investigator Wardlaw asked us to go collect the photos and the clothing from the victim at the hospital.
Let me hand you these photos and ask you, do you recognize those photos?
Yes, ma'am.
And what are those photos of?
These are photographs taken at UT Medical Center of bullet penetration or
and all of your work on this case. It's been hard. It's been a long case. And I want to thank you first. On behalf of Ms. Gutierrez Reed, who this is extremely important for her, this case, and this is her day in court. And it's extremely important that the government rule out every reasonable doubt that there is in this case, because that is our standard in this country. Reasonable doubt is a concept, meaning if you have any reasonable doubt, if you have a reasonable doubt, we cannot convict people in this country. That's how it's set up. Because of that, the burden is on the prosecution, always stays on the prosecution, and so they have to rule out all of the reasonable doubts. In this case, and I'm going to talk about a lot of the evidence soon, but I just want to start with a summary. The prosecutor just presented to you a series of pictures, and those were the pictures they paid the guy $10,000 to enlarge. And they went through the pictures and they tried to show that there were silver primers, and this is going to be definitive evidence that these live rounds had to be on set at a particular time. Let me tell you why there's reasonable doubt, number one, that they will never be able to rule out in this case. Sarah Zachary threw away rounds. She unquestionably threw away rounds after the shooting. It's undisputed. We have no idea what those look like. We will never have an idea what they look like, and that will never be able to be overcome. That one fact alone prevents that entire picture setup that was just shown to you from being accurate, from being real. Because we have no idea what those other rounds, whether they had silver primers, whether they were dummies, whether they were other types of dummies, what they look like. We have no idea. Fact two on the pictures. Seth Kenney told you he had gotten live rounds from Thel Reed that went to the 1883 set. Those live rounds were three types. There were three types of bullets. He then brought back around 125 of those, of the three types. Now, the ones that the state seized, the prosecutors made a point of saying these don't match the live rounds. However, we don't know what he had, because they waited a month to go get him. It was over a month when they searched. And when Mr. Kenney brought in the rounds, he had been talking to the investigator about what was going on in the investigation. So we're never going to have an idea as to what Seth Kenney had and what he provided, because he also told you in this trial he had no inventory system. He had no idea what was coming in and going out of his place. The place was a wreck. Looked like a train had hit it. There's no way for somebody to really understand what they're putting in, what they're going out. And so he also said there were things that went onto the Rust set that he hadn't inventoried, hadn't invoiced. He said that there were things that put on there that he didn't have invoiced. So here's the problem with that. We do not know that Seth Kenney only had those patinaed rounds. That's reasonable doubt. That's coming right from the government's witnesses, from Mr. Kenny. That part is unreconcilable. There is a reasonable doubt that we'll never leave this case on those 2 points, on the pictures and the live rounds. Now, Ms. Morrissey calls it dishonest for us to raise a question about Mr. Kenny. And I submit it's not dishonest at all, because they have the burden to investigate every possibility, every aspect, as anybody in Ms. Gutierrez Reed's place would deserve and would want, because their life is on the line as well on felony charges, and it's the government's duty to rule out all these other things. Far from dishonest, what it is thoroughness, competence, finding what happened with Seth Kenny, taking his fingerprints, taking his DNA, going through and searching earlier, doing that investigation, and finding out if indeed there is another possibility that they ruled out right away and they never wanted to look into, because they rushed to judgment on Ms. Gutierrez Reed from the very beginning. They singled her out on that set. They put her in a cop car, whether she asked or whether they put her in. She's in the cop car and she never leaves custody until after her statement. They singled her out and they rushed to judgment on her, and that's what you've seen ever since. Ms. Morrissey says, a camera crew, and she mocks things that we raise as possibilities on the idea that none of it can be possible except Ms. Gutierrez Reed is guilty. That is the only thing that can be possible because I say it. It's not how it works. Ms. Morrissey said she indicted Mr. Baldwin. I indicted Mr. Baldwin. Actually, I think it's the state of New Mexico. That's not an individual person with that power. She also sat there when Ms. Zachary was on the stand, and Ms. Zachary, I'll remind you, got an immunity agreement. Ms. Zachary was promised she would never be prosecuted. And Ms. Morrissey stands up and says, there's no evidence against Ms. Zachary. Well, then why was she given an immunity agreement? Why would she need immunity if there's nothing against Ms. Zachary? She's given an immunity agreement, and then she's told on redirect examination by Ms. Morrissey, remember, if you don't tell the truth, I can prosecute you. I will prosecute you. So Ms. Zachary doesn't tell the version of the truth that the government believes is true. We saw the threat in live court. You can't trust some of the witness testimony in this case, and that will raise a reasonable doubt as well, I submit, because of things like that. Because the lead investigator admits that she practiced her answers and questions with the prosecutor. That's something you can consider. Are you hearing everything? Or are you hearing a one-sided version that fits the narrative that Ms. Gutierrez Reed has to be guilty because we picked her out first and it's got to be her? Can't be Mr. Kenny, can't be anything else, any other possibilities. Sarah Zachary has nothing to do with it. Even though we know unquestionably she threw away rounds after a shooting. That's undoubtedly going to be evidence, but there's nothing on her, apparently. Second, these boxes. The idea that the boxes match. We heard testimony that these rounds were loaded in and out of these boxes daily. Nobody knows what was in them on the 13th, the 16th, the 21st, because the rounds were put in, they were taken out, and they were put in different boxes. So the boxes really don't matter. There's reasonable doubt all over the place to the boxes because we don't know what was in them 3 or 4 days before. It doesn't matter who brought them. The boxes are interesting because the government wants to match up the two, and they want to show the pictures that match, yet all the ones from PDQ Props have the same label, same font. They're from Joe Swanson. So those boxes are similar to the ones on set. So that part is not conclusive as well. The other part, when the government shows you video and video and video only on the 13th, and says Ms. Gutierrez-Reed was lax on safety. Well, again, you're seeing videos from short snippets of time on one day on an entire movie set, and then you're not seeing what Ms. Gutierrez-Reed may have done right after the clip. You're not seeing what might have happened right after that. The other thing that strongly rebuts all of the safety points Ms. Morrissey is pointing out about Ms. Gutierrez-Reed is OSHA. Now, they try to downplay OSHA, but OSHA is a separate, independent state and federal agency that did a full investigation into the responsibility for safety failures on this set. And you can evaluate the credibility in your minds of Mr. Montoya, who took the stand, and how you thought he testified, whether you thought he was thorough and how he answered questions. He interviewed quite a few people, and he reviewed a lot of information. Their conclusion after that was done was that production was responsible. He said the root cause was production adopted a safety plan, and it ended at the word adoption, because they didn't do anything after that. They didn't respond to complaints that there were safety concerns. They didn't allow for more training and take the time to do that. They did not respond to the negligent discharges and deal with that. Mr. Halls talked to one of the guys briefly, and that was all that happened. So you got a set that they're not allowing time for inventory for the armor. They're not allowing time for them to clean their weapons or deal with their weapons. This is management. You just heard Mr. Pesh state that the first assistant director is the primary person for safety on that set. Dave Halls has been doing this 30 years. Somebody doing it 30 years has a responsibility and duty to step in when there's safety things going on, and he's on several of those videos. He has a responsibility to step in and say, hey, we're going to stop this. We're going to slow this down. We're going to have meetings. We're going to have additional safety training, and we're going to address this. Ms. Gutierrez-Reed, come over here. We're going to do this, and we're going to talk to people. She also can come in and talk about that. And on those videos, they're both on the videos. But OSHA found, because of the lack of support, because she's a part-time armorer, because she's not full-time, because there's not two of her, as Mr. Carpenter said, 2 is 1 and 1 is none. Well, here we didn't even have 1. We had a half. So she's trying to run around and do various things. She's a half a job on a set with over 20 guns, and they want to lay the complete blame on her in this case, as opposed to OSHA, who investigated as an official agency and made an official determination that this was production and management that was responsible. That's important. That's an important finding, because they said all of this was caused safety-wise by management. As Mr. Sousa told you, the buck stops with production. The buck stops with production. As in any organization, it starts at the top. You don't go and take one of the lowest people on the call sheet after something bad happens, after the whole management team is just thrown safety aside in favor of money, in favor of speed, in favor of profit. You throw all of that aside, because at the end, you've got a convenient fall person. You've got a convenient scapegoat. And she may not be the armorer on some days. She's a props person, but she's certainly the armorer when everything goes bad. You know why? Because despite OSHA's findings that they were responsible, production, the guys that you saw come in, the producers, the big guys, they want to sail off into the sunset and go on about their business, finish the movie, make the money, because they've got the convenient fall person sitting right here. And all that has to happen is everybody has to gang up. Everybody has to have their talks after this happened and blame Hannah. So it has to happen. That's what happened in this case. You had a production company on a shoestring budget, an A-list actor that was really running the show. He was directing people in those clips, telling the camera person where to go, telling the armorer where to go. And then you had a situation where at the end they had somebody they could all blame. It didn't work out with OSHA because OSHA didn't buy it. OSHA said it was the higher-ups. So here we are in a criminal court where the government tries to pin all of it on Ms. Gutierrez-Reed. And it's just not the truth. It's absolutely right. We do want the truth. We want the truth and all the facts that were found by OSHA to be considered. We wanted all of the facts that you don't have in this courtroom to be considered, because that's the only fair way to do it, to resolve all reasonable doubt and to rule it out. If you don't have all the evidence, you can't rule out all of that reasonable doubt. I want to talk about foreseeability, and I want to play this for you. You probably remember that. That was the scene where Mr. Baldwin runs up the hill and cut is yelled. And right after cut is yelled, he shoots. That's, I submit, reasonable doubt, and I'll tell you why. Because Mr. Baldwin went off script. He chose to fire after cut was called. And you're going to see where he does later do the same thing in this tragic shooting. Mamie Mitchell told you on the stand, the script supervisor, that it was not in the script for Mr. Baldwin to point the weapon. It was not in the script for him to point the weapon. And we have to be very careful with facts when we're considering a criminal case and the beyond the reasonable doubt standard. That's extremely important, because Ms. Gutierrez-Reed, nor anybody else, knew that Mr. Baldwin in that moment was going to point the weapon right at Helena and Mr. Hutchins and Mr. Souza and do what he did. That is the concept of foreseeability. Now, Ms. Morrissey gave you an example of, if I hand somebody a firearm and it's loaded, and then they go and do something with it, and it hurts somebody. But here, what we had, she did not know Mr. Baldwin was going to do what he did. No one, first of all, called her back into the church that he was using the gun at that time. She had given it to Halls to sit in the church. Mr. Halls then gave it to Mr. Baldwin, and that is the conclusion of the lead investigator. That was what Baldwin said, and that is what Ms. Gutierrez-Reed said. So Halls hands it to him. No one calls her back in to let her know Baldwin is doing that blocking scene. She doesn't know that's happening. The medic said she did not hear anybody call that out, first team, over the channel. So that's not getting put out. So Baldwin's doing another audible like he did on this video that you just saw. He's going off script. That defeats any idea that that was foreseeable to Ms. Gutierrez-Reed. If she doesn't know what's happening, she can't foresee it. That's a big part of the instruction. The other part I want to talk about foreseeability and where this matters is live rounds. Now, live rounds in this type of situation has not happened in Hollywood. In the 100 years of Hollywood, this has not happened in a situation like we saw in this case. No one on that set foresaw, knew, or thought that live rounds were going to be on that set. No one. You did not hear one witness in this case. Even Ms. Morrissey said there was no evidence that Hannah knew about live rounds coming on, or this was done. There's no evidence of that. Nobody thought live rounds were going to be on set. Mr. Souza told the doctors he couldn't believe it. He argued with them because it was inconceivable that live rounds would appear. Because of that, when you read the jury instructions, there's a concept in the involuntary manslaughter of an element of willful disregard of the rights of another. That word willful, and I'm going to go over it soon, means purposeful. That you willfully do something, you purposefully do something. What's impossible for the government to prove in this case.
Can we approach?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about willful more in a moment when we get there, but it cannot be willful if Hannah does not know there's live rounds, and nobody did. So she did not do something willfully knowing that Baldwin could foreseeably hurt somebody with this firearm because she didn't know it was live. And let me give you an example. It's akin to a nurse, let's say in a hospital, who the pharmacy mislabels a drug. And let's say it comes to her and somebody's ordered it be administered to a patient. She then administers it not knowing that it's a fatal drug of some other type. The pharmacy's mislabeled it. The patient passes. It's the same situation as we have here, where the government would be saying the nurse committed involuntary manslaughter. No, that's not true, because she did not know what happened. It's like a long time ago when the Tylenol capsules were laced with cyanide, way back in the 80s or somewhere around there. There was no prosecution of the pharmacies that didn't know about this, that were tainted by it. It's the same type of situation we have here with the nurse. Miss Gutierrez Reed did not know there were live rounds, and she was entitled to rely on production buying dummies and the boxes labeled dummies. She's entitled to rely on that. And that reliance is reasonable. So she cannot foresee a live round. Now, I want to talk next about Miss Gutierrez Reed's statements to law enforcement. You saw her first statement. She didn't have an attorney. She did waive her rights and answer her question. She had not been advised at that time. Ms. Hutchins had passed. And she came in a second time and answered all questions. The reason why I say that is she was cooperative. She was trying to assist in what this investigation, what they were investigating. Now, Corporal Hancock never fully investigated the source of the live rounds. And she told you that she focused on people on the set. So again, in ruling out reasonable doubt and where those live rounds came from, we have not done that in this case because there was never a full investigation as to the source of the live rounds. Let me give you an example. The state never called Joe Swanson. And it's kind of remarkable because Joe Swanson was the original source of where these came from. He's also the JS on all the boxes. So the idea that the person where it originated, you wouldn't call that person and get some more information is interesting. But more than that, it leaves a huge hole in the origin of the live rounds. Let me tell you what else it did. Seth Kinney's fingerprints and DNA were never taken. Seth Kinney talked to Corporal Hancock 40 times or more. They supplied information back and forth. And he starts making you wonder about what's going on and why I'm called dishonest for raising the possibility that maybe Mr. Kinney was the source. Because he's pretty tight with law enforcement in this case. Obviously. They don't do a prop search warrant until 6 days after the incident, and that was Corporal Hancock and the rest of the sheriffs. They don't search Mr. Kinney's business until over a month after. They never asked the FBI to check live rounds for fingerprints or DNA. And so we will not know if Mr. Kinney's fingerprints or anybody else's would have ever appeared on those live rounds on set because they didn't get that evidence. Bryce Ziegler, I want to tell you a little bit, remind you a little bit about his testimony, and that's Mr. Ziegler. He talked about Baldwin's revolver being single action. You have to cock it, and then every time you want to shoot it. He testified about breaking that firearm. They actually destroyed the firearm after testing that was approved by the sheriff by hitting that with a hammer. He talked about that you can't determine a live round from a picture. And that's the other point I think is important to consider when considering the picture analysis. Now, the Latin print examiner, examined various things, but she did not examine anything Seth Kinney-wise. There's no analysis on the cartridges from the prop cart, and found 8 FBI employee prints. Mr. Gillette, on the powder testing, only tested 11 rounds from Seth Kinney. Again, we know that he brought back 125 from the group that went to 1883. And I also want to remind you about 1883, some of those were Starline brass rounds. And some of those, he said, had silver primers. So when we get to the set, the live rounds are Starline brass, and they have silver primers. It's a continuous chain that could have been traced from Del Reed all the way to Seth Kinney, all the way back to the set. But they did not do that thorough investigation, and that's reasonable doubt they have not ruled out. The dummies, again, I submit this is another area of reasonable doubt. Witnesses testified this set contained a dangerous mix of dummies. They were dangerous because it was impossible for the armor and prop master to hear and rattle all of the dummies, especially under pressure, rushing, and noise on the set. You saw there was a lot of wind that day on the lapel. There's people running around. There's, I think at one point somebody said 200 people. There's all kinds of things going on. And despite that, Mr. Haig indicated in a quiet office he could not hear one of the dummies when it's rattled. That's dangerous because when you're trying to do it quickly, when there's a lot of noise, it may be a dummy, it may not. You can't hear it rattle. Seth Kinney, again, mentioned in this case that he always rattle tested his rounds, and he made sure they're dummies. He told you all that. Well, the problem, even the box that they say was Seth Kinney's and the rounds that came out of it, there was one round, if you remember, that was gunked, and it didn't shake. That round had to be sent to the FBI to be broken apart and to be checked to see if it was live. So if he truly is that thorough in shaking, he missed that round. Now the producers, they had oversight over the budget team. They didn't know where the funds were set aside for the armor. They were on location for filming, and they were fined the statutory maximum by OSHA for managerial safety violations. Again, OSHA found that the management team are the ones responsible, and yet we're here with Ms. Gutierrez Reed, the person on trial for the felony offenses. Sherilyn Schaefer was the medic on set. You recall she did not have chest seals. She, I think, was doing the best she could with the equipment that she had, but she didn't have the complete equipment to deal with a gunshot wound. She also indicated she never heard anyone call out use of a gun before the fatal shooting. Mamie Mitchell, I touched on this earlier. Most important thing Ms. Mitchell said was that it was not in the script for Baldwin to point the firearm. That goes directly to the element when you read the jury instructions and you all go back in to deliberate. That goes to foreseeability. And whether or not anybody can foresee the moments Mr. Baldwin pointing the gun, using it as a pointer, he's up on the hill shooting after cut, and then he's shooting pointing the gun when he's not supposed to in scenes. David Halls was the first assistant director, as you remember, and he was in charge of overall safety. Now, he got a misdemeanor, 6 months unsupervised probation, even though he was in charge of overall set safety. He never raised any concerns, and in fact, I think he said Hannah did a great job as armor. He indicated he did not hand the gun to Baldwin, but the sheriff contradicted this, so did Hannah, and so did Mr. Baldwin. And that was essentially Mr. Hall's testimony. Sarah Zachary, I remind you, she threw away rounds on set after the shooting, took items off the prop card. She worked for Seth Kenney, and she texted and called him right after the shooting. One of her texts, she indicated she had said she was talking to Alec Baldwin and trying to keep her facts straight. She mentioned that she had loaded firearms on set. She picked up ammunition from Kenney at PDQ. I'll remind you in the testimony that Sarah Zachary and Hannah Gutierrez Reed went to Kenney's place before production started, and he had given them ammunition, leathers, and firearms. So again, we don't know exactly what Mr. Kenney may have supplied to this set because it's not inventoried, it's not all invoiced. I also remind you about Sarah Zachary when you're considering her credibility and her testimony. She had the text where she wanted Hannah to go to jail, and she's given complete immunity. Seth Kenney, again, I mentioned this, he supplied the leathers, guns, and ammo before arrest began. He had no inventory system. And we attached some pictures to the right that you can look at in the jury room about his place. It was an absolute mess. There was stored live ammo in the bathroom. And one of the things I think was important to remind you of is he actually called Joe Swanson and had a conversation with him. And after he gets off the call, his first words are, "Shit, shit, shit." And so that's something as an investigator you would think after he does that, maybe I should call Joe Swanson and see what's happening, see what that means. That reasonable doubt has not been ruled out. I went over this on the 1883 set, and he brought 125 rounds back. Mr. Carpenter, I want to remind you, he was the state's expert armorer. One of the most important points he said was 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And here we didn't have a properly staffed armorer component to the set. Luke Haig, he said the live rounds on set were reloads. He could not hear the dummy rattle in a quiet office, and he said Mr. Baldwin violated basic safety rules. Karen Kuhn, you may remember, was the photographer. She said the armorer was checking guns before when she was present. And she also made a comment about Mr. Baldwin, that on the day she was taking questions, I believe she said on the 21st, he told her to get out of his personal space and said something in a manner that kind of goes along with how he was on the set. Mr. Souza was kind about it. He said he had a strong personality, but you can see it in the videos, and you can see how Mr. Baldwin was acting. Rebecca Smith, I want to talk about the tampering. She said that she hadn't used cocaine in 31 years. She saw a baggie inside a baggie for approximately 5 seconds. She didn't know if it was cocaine or meth or something else. Now, she admitted at the end she was guessing. And we also know that the substance in the baggie was never tested. And so the only evidence you have of narcotics in this case is a guess. Now, Ms. Morrissey in her closing indicated that, well, of course we don't have the evidence. The whole thing is throwing it away. Well, you have to prove first that it was evidence. So in a normal tampering case, when, let's say, a firearm's thrown away, and we know a firearm was used, and somebody throws a firearm away, we know that was a firearm. So we know that would be evidence in a case involving a shooting. Here, we have an unknown substance. Again, they have to rule out all of the reasonable doubt by that. It's not enough to say it's probably something under a criminal standard. It's probably cocaine in that bag because Miss Smith says it is. If it even happened, we don't even know this happened. The government hasn't established that except through her testimony. We don't know if there was a bag. We don't know if this actually was passed. And that's their burden. Let's say it did happen, that you believe it did happen. It's not enough to say what was probably in that bag. They have the burden to rule it out beyond a reasonable doubt that it couldn't have been anything else. And she's already calling it in her testimony potentially multiple substances, cocaine, methamphetamine, or possibly something else. So she's not even certain about what it is. Without a test, without something presumptive to tell you on a test, there's no way of telling what was in that bag. And it's not enough in a criminal case. OSHA we talked about in detail, and I just want to remind you the root cause they found, they attributed all the responsibility for safety issues to management. Mr. Elliott, he was a defense expert investigator, got an extensive law enforcement experience, if you recall, in APD and military. One of his big points was Mr. Baldwin was not segregated at the beginning, even though he was the known shooter. Hannah was segregated right away. Again, they zeroed in on her in the rush to have her identified. He indicated there was 20 or so key witnesses not identified and segregated. And the problem with that is they can get their stories together and they can change their stories. They can have their memories altered. We know this happened in this case because after the incident, Mr. Baldwin is talking to Sarah Zachary. He's texting and talking to her. Seth Kinney's talking to Sarah Zachary. Mr. Halls is talking to Baldwin after. And so we don't have all the information they're talking about, but we do know they're coordinating, they're talking. The only one not in that group was Hannah. And again, this was the idea. We've got to circle the wagons, and we've got to pick out the person that's going to take the fall for everything that's happened here. That's Hannah. That's who they got. Law enforcement failed to follow up on the origin of the live rounds, and their delayed search warrants caused problems with missing evidence. P.J. Pesh testified just this morning. He had said, like everybody else, he's never seen in 35 years an armor split duties with props. It's not possible for one person to keep track of so many firearms. And he indicated it's important to give the armor adequate time and resources, which OSHA said as well. She was not given that to do her job. I want to talk to you about the law that the judge instructed you on, and that is the law. What the judge told you about is what we have to follow in terms of evaluating this. The law presumes the defendant to be innocent. The burden is always on the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is a doubt based upon reason and common sense. The kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act in the graver and more important affairs of life. A doubt based on reason and common sense. So what the government has to do is rule out every reasonable doubt you may have based on reason and common sense. Or in this country, we don't convict people. That's the standard. And again, I go back to where I started at the beginning. If they didn't rule out the reasonable doubt on Miss Zachary throwing away the rounds, that is always going to be there. Because their theory based on you can identify these pictures and we know exactly what was on the set and what remained on the set, we will never know that because some of them were thrown away. And we didn't get all of Seth Kinney's rounds. We're never going to know that. Other areas of reasonable doubt, I've gone over the top two, top three. The prop cart was tampered with. We know that right after the incident, another individual moved it. Now, Lieutenant Benavides said he had eyes on the entire time. But if you saw that video, you can make up your mind what you believe. ladies and gentlemen, his camera appeared to be pointed right into the vehicle, and the individual getting the cart was way off in the other direction. He said he had his head turned, but you all can decide what you think about that. The prop cart, there was unquestionably items taken from it. We don't know exactly what those are. That is another area of reasonable doubt that the government has not ruled out. You've had witnesses say throughout the trial you can't tell live ammo from a picture. And the reason is that the FBI said it has to be disassembled and you have to open it up because there's powder in it. If there's not powder in it, then it's not live. OSHA stated the root cause of all safety failures was management. OMI ruled this to be an accident, not a homicide. You heard evidence about the esophageal intubation was ineffective to provide oxygen to Helena. This also was a situation in this case where multiple lawsuits have been filed, and you can evaluate their testimony, those people who have filed lawsuits, with care and caution, because they've got an interest potentially in what's happening in this case by being involved in lawsuits. Involuntary manslaughter, you're going to have that instruction when you go back. That is the charge that Her Honor has read to you. She's given you the law on this. I want to focus you on a couple key points. The government has the burden to show each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. The elements are the numbered items. What that means is if you all have reasonable doubts on any of these elements, Hannah cannot be convicted. And I want to focus you in on element 3, that Hannah acted with a willful disregard. Again, you go back to willful disregard, the nurse example, and the idea that if somebody doesn't know, I mean, that could be the same thing with a nurse on trial for involuntary manslaughter, but if she doesn't know the drug was mislabeled, you cannot hold her criminally accountable for something like that. It's the same thing in this case, because no one knew there were live rounds. So she did not act willfully in anything that happened that day. In loading the firearm, this was another day everybody thought on set. Loading the firearms, running to different things, doing the duties. Nobody's calling her back in for the blocking scene. Mr. Baldwin's doing something on his own. Nobody in the wildest dreams thought there was a live round. And because of that, the next element is that Hannah Gutierrez Reed that caused the death. I submit to you that what caused her to pass was Mr. Baldwin going off script and pointing the weapon. Now, he didn't know there was a live round in there either. He didn't know. Again, he's in the same position that nobody knew there was ever going to be a live round on that set. But the only ultimate act is pointing of that weapon. Miss Gutierrez wasn't in the church. She didn't point that weapon. She didn't pull it. Nobody called her back in. And because of that, those two elements, I submit to you, have not been proven on involuntary manslaughter. And they have to be. The government has to resolve all your reasonable doubts about that, or we cannot convict. Mental state and willful disregard, and that is going to be in your instructions. For you to find the defendant acted negligently in this case, you must find that the defendant acted with willful disregard. And so again, that's the terminology, is willful disregard. You're also going to be instructed, the court instructed you, Her Honor, on negligent use of a firearm. And that is a lesser included offense of the involuntary manslaughter. So when you go back and deliberate, you will have this in front of you as well, whether Miss Gutierrez Reed endangered the safety of another by handling or using a firearm in a negligent manner. And again, the language is acted with willful disregard. That's what has to be proven under that.
Feel as if you're free from allergies and gravity. Live Claritin Clear.
real stretch, and it is a real stretch, and you talk about guessing. This one, they have to prove the defendant hid a bag of cocaine. Well, the only witness they have to it said it was either cocaine or meth or something else. So just by the testimony alone, the beginning of that, there's no way of knowing it was a bag of cocaine. It's just impossible. There has to be reasonable doubt on that by the government's own witness. Their only witness. No law enforcement testing, there's nobody else. This is absolutely unproven in this case. And you don't even have to get to element 2 because element 1 is not even close to having been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Proximate cause, it's a legal term, but it's something the government has to prove as well. And this is where you get into that the passing was a foreseeable result of Hannah Gutierrez's act. The act was a significant cause of the death, and the language I want to focus you in a natural and continuous chain of events uninterrupted by an outside event. What these mean, and these are the legal terminology, what it means is that what Hannah Gutierrez did had to be a foreseeable result, but again, that caused her death. But again, without her knowing that there was a live round, that's impossible to meet that standard. She did not have that knowledge, and there's no witness that came in here in this courtroom in 2 weeks to say she had that knowledge. Without it, nothing she did, she has that willful disregard because she just doesn't know. Now, was there an outside event as well? There was an outside event. There's 2 outside events. Whoever put the live round on set, and then Mr. Baldwin in the end going off script and doing what he did. Those are outside events, outside of Miss Gutierrez Reed's control, that she didn't know was going to happen. That breaks any idea, and there's reasonable doubt that she had anything to do, ultimately, with Helena Hutchins' death. Miss Gutierrez Reed was not a significant cause as a result of her death, because of the reasons I've mentioned to you. Another instruction Her Honor gave you is that negligence of a third person, again I'm going to highlight the language, if it breaks the foreseeable chain of events. Again, the foreseeable chain of events on that set is you have dummy rounds, you have blank rounds, and then you have an orderly progression with how those are being used. Here we had a completely unforeseeable live round, 6 live rounds that were on set, nobody could foresee. And then we have Mr. Baldwin's action in the end. Those were both unforeseeable to Miss Gutierrez Reed. The judge instructed you all are the sole judge of the facts. You all are deciding the facts, ladies and gentlemen. And your verdict should not be based on speculation, guess, or conjecture. That goes back to the tampering charge. It goes back to some of the other aspects the government has told you. In this country, we can't decide and convict people on guesses. And that's a lot of what they've asked you to do in several areas, to guess, to assume, to speculate. It's not sufficient to convict people in this country to guess. It's not. And that's what they brought you and they've asked you to do on the tampering and other aspects of their charges. And that's not sufficient. Ladies and gentlemen, Hannah is not guilty on all the counts because of the law that Her Honor has given you. When you apply that law and you apply the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, she could not anticipate what Baldwin would do. It was not in the script. It was not foreseeable. Management was responsible for safety failures and not Hannah. There's zero evidence of cocaine. There's no testing. And again, I go back to the idea that Hannah is a scapegoat for all the management failures. They do hope she gets convicted, so they're all exonerated. They can move forward. They can finish that movie like Mr. Sousa said they did and make their money. But as he also told you, the buck always stops with production, and it's their responsibility. in any organization, it goes from the top down. And that's where the responsibility lies in this case. That's what OSHA said. And that's also the truth. And the truth is important, because justice for Helena does not mean injustice for Hannah. Does not mean injustice for Hannah. It does not mean they get to steamroll her and they get to come in and spin their version of facts and they get to call it truth. Because that's not truth. Truth is bringing you, ladies and gentlemen, everything they can. Justice is bringing you everything they can. Justice is not mocking theories that could come true, that might have been the case. Justice is not laughing in court during some of our exchanges. And you can evaluate that as to their credibility, whether that was professional, whether if she didn't take court seriously, did she take the investigation seriously? I submit she did not. And so they can't come in here with a straight face and mock us and criticize us and tell you they have given you enough to convict her behind a reasonable doubt, because they haven't. Thank you.
State's reply.
I'll begin while the gentlemen are setting up the Elmo for me. Hannah didn't know there was a live round on set. I agree. If Hannah knew there was a live round on set and she loaded it into a prop gun and it was used to kill Helena Hutchins, she wouldn't be charged with involuntary manslaughter. She'd be charged with second-degree murder. She'd be charged with first-degree depraved mind murder. This is an involuntary manslaughter charge because she didn't know there were live rounds on set, and the reason she didn't know was through her own negligence, her own recklessness, her own willful disregard for the safety of other people. That willful disregard, that lack of care for the safety of other people that you have seen throughout this trial, it is shocking. For Mr. Bowles to come up to this podium and say it wasn't foreseeable that Alec Baldwin was going to go off script and pull the hammer and pull the trigger, he showed you a video of Alec Baldwin going off script. Alec Baldwin went off script. Hannah Gutierrez knew it. She was there. Hannah Gutierrez knew that Baldwin was loose. She knew it. She didn't do anything about it, even though it was her job. It was her job. It is her job to say to an A-list actor, if in fact that's what you want to call him, hey, you can't behave that way with those firearms. That is her job. That is what they pay her for. That is the job that she applied for. That is the job that she accepted. Foreseeability. You want to talk about off script? Just remember those videos of the stuntman. That's not within the script. She was there. She watched it. She knew these people would go off script. You know she didn't check the rounds. If she checked the rounds, they wouldn't have been floating around that movie set the entire time, undetected. Give you everything we've got. You have absolutely everything we have. This law enforcement team and this team of prosecutors have reviewed thousands and thousands and thousands of photos and thousands of videos. We have interviewed countless people, many of whom you didn't even hear from. We can't stay here forever. You have absolutely everything you need. One of the amazingly shocking things about this case to me has always been, and it's to Detective Hancock's credit, a defense attorney with his own agenda, no question, comes to her and says, it's Seth Kenney, it's Seth Kenney, it's Seth Kenney. That's his job. Okay? Let's make that clear. That's Mr. Bowles' job. He gets Hannah's dad to say, it's Seth Kenney, it's Seth Kenney, it's Seth Kenney. Rather than ignore them, she gets a search warrant. She took his speculative agenda, presented it to a judge, got a search warrant, and searched that man's property. And oh my heavens, what did they find? They found exactly what Thel Reed said they would find. They found live ammunition with semi-wad cutter projectiles. You have everything you have. You have everything we have. You have everything you will ever need to convict her. This is 100% foreseeable. Hannah Gutierrez is not a scapegoat. Hannah Gutierrez is not being treated as a scapegoat. Mr. Halls was charged criminally. To his credit, he took an early plea and he got the benefit of that. Mr. Baldwin has now been indicted. Everyone with criminal culpability has been criminally charged in this case. She's not being scapegoated. She is being treated like everyone else. She is not being given a break because she's a woman. She is not being given a break because she's young. Because that's not how the law works. Let me just review my notes real quick, and as I promised you, I am going to try to speed this up for you. Please keep in mind, Mr. Bowles comes up to the podium and says Sarah Zachary threw rounds away. She did. Obviously she did. She admitted it. She told law enforcement that she did it. And rather than try to prosecute her for tampering with evidence, for panicking and throwing some rounds away, she agreed to come in and testify, and her agreement is that she must testify truthfully. And she testified truthfully. You want to know why we don't have an inertia puller in evidence? Why we don't have a box of dummies that Ms. Gutierrez said she brought on set? She said she brought 2 boxes. We've only got 1. You want to know why? Because she went to the prop truck on October 23rd, got access to it, took a bunch of gun belts, and a couple of boxes.
Your Honor, I want to object.
Where were we? She took stuff out of the prop truck. She took gun belts. You heard from Sarah Zachary that those were gun belts that she brought from another movie set that were already loaded with dummy rounds. Who knows what was in them? So I want to make sure that we understand what reasonable doubt means. Reasonable doubt means the doubt must be reasonable. It is not a reasonable doubt to cast suspicion on Brian Norvell. It is not a reasonable doubt to cast suspicion on Seth Kinney. All investigative leads were exhausted. He simply didn't do anything wrong. You want to talk about scapegoating? That's the guy that got scapegoated. The doubt must be reasonable. And I don't have to prove this case beyond all possible doubt. If that is what the law required, my heavens, we live in a world of infinite possibilities. The government would never be able to prove a case beyond all possible doubt. We'd have to have a video of absolutely everything that took place. It's not the standard, and it doesn't have to be the standard. So when you're back there and you're talking about doubt, make sure it's a reasonable one under this set of circumstances. You know, Mr. Bowles says to you, these production outfitters were just from one day. That's right. All that happened in one day. Imagine what all the other days were like. That was one day. Mr. Balls is right. The crew didn't believe there were live rounds on set. They believed that she was going to do her job. They believed that she did her job. This isn't Seth Kinney's responsibility to inventory rounds, although he did it. That wasn't his responsibility. Rust Productions didn't provide all of the dummy rounds to the set of this movie. You know from her own statements she brought 2 boxes on herself. We're not living in an alternate reality. All right. Let's go through these. I'll go through them relatively quickly. When you all go back into the jury deliberation room, you will have your own copy. So you certainly will have a copy to reference. These are some of the instructions that are important to us. Your verdict should not be based on sympathy or prejudice. Sympathy or prejudice? Huh?
It's not showing on the screen.
Oh. Oh, I see. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. So it can't be based on sympathy or prejudice. And for any of you who are feeling sympathetic because she is young and she is maybe inexperienced, although by her own statement to Detective Hancock, she would tell you she wasn't. You all are on this jury because during voir dire you agreed to follow the law. And I will ask you to do it right now. If you had said during voir dire, I can't follow the law, I feel too sympathetic, you wouldn't be here. And if you can't follow the law, you can probably excuse yourselves. I'm going to skip that one. That's an easy one. You must not concern yourselves with the consequences of your verdict. That is the law. That is the law that you agreed to follow. That is the law that you are required to follow. Hannah Gutierrez endangered the safety of another by handling or using a firearm in a negligent manner. There can be absolutely no doubt. That happened. Hannah Gutierrez should have known of the danger involved by her actions. Yeah, she knew. This was completely foreseeable. She was trained in firearms. She knows what we all know. Guns can kill you. You gotta be really careful. Her act caused the death of Helena Hutchins. (12A) is the alternative theory. And so let me explain to you that 12 and 12A are alternatives. You must make a decision about guilt or innocence unanimously to the count, not to the alternatives. So 6 of you can say, I think she's guilty of 12, but not 12A. Another 6 of you can say, we think she's guilty of 12A, but not 12. Done. You're done. Hannah Gutierrez loaded live ammunition into a firearm. Yes, she certainly did. She told the police she did. She failed to perform an adequate safety check of the ammunition. Of course, you know that. She didn't do it just once. She did it numerous times. She acted with willful disregard for the safety of others, without question. So you are being presented with what's called a lesser included offense. And I will remind you the instructions that the judge read you at the beginning. Your first job is to see if you can agree on involuntary manslaughter. If you find her guilty of involuntary manslaughter on either alternative, you do not move on to this misdemeanor. It's done. If you find her not guilty of involuntary manslaughter, then you get to move on to the misdemeanor. You've heard a lot about that. I'll skip it. This is what we call a general criminal intent instruction, and I want to just make sure that you understand this instruction only applies to the tampering with evidence. It does not apply to the involuntary manslaughter because she is charged with negligent homicide, not intentional. Very importantly are the proximate cause jury instructions. These jury instructions are what allows you to find Ms. Gutierrez guilty, even though Mr. Baldwin may have also been a significant cause of the death of Helena Hutchins. So let's go through it. The death was a foreseeable result of Hannah Gutierrez placing a live round into a firearm. Of course it was. The act of the defendant was a significant cause of the death of Helena Hutchins. The defendant's act was a significant cause of death if it was an act which, in a natural and continuous chain of events, uninterrupted by an outside event, resulted in the death, and without which the death would not have occurred. She brought a bunch of live rounds on set, accidentally, but negligently. She loaded one of them into a prop gun, and this was after they were loaded into Jensen Ackles' gun belt and Alec Baldwin's holster. And she told Dave Halls, this is a cold gun. He told the crew, it's a cold gun. At that point, everyone certainly assumed that there wasn't a live round. She knew Baldwin would go off script. She didn't have prop duties to tend to. She walked out. And even if she had been there, it wouldn't have made a difference, because you have seen the incredible lack of control that she exercised as the only person on the movie set in charge of firearms. There is no intervening event. If you think the intervening event is that Baldwin manipulated the gun, that's the whole purpose of the prop. He's going to manipulate it. You saw a bunch of other actors do it. Very importantly, there may be more than one significant cause of death. If the acts of two or more persons significantly contribute to the cause of death, each act is a significant cause of death. If you think Baldwin's act was a significant cause of death, that's okay. You can still convict her. Jury instruction 20. If you find the negligence of a person other than the defendant was the only significant cause of death, or constitutes an intervening cause that breaks the foreseeable chain of events, the defendant is not guilty. Well, that's not this case. She brought the live rounds on set. She put a live round in a prop gun. That's the reason that Ms. Hutchins is dead. One of at least two reasons. I will again thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I know that this has been hard work for you folks. I will ask you to find Ms. Gutierrez guilty of involuntary manslaughter and tampering with evidence. And I will ask you to bring some justice to Helena Hutchins. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Instruction number 22. I will now ask you to retire to the jury room to begin your deliberations. You will be provided a copy of the jury instructions, and the exhibits introduced as evidence will be made available to you. Prior to beginning your deliberations, you will need to select one of you to act as foreperson. That person will preside over your deliberations and will speak for the jury here in court. Forms of verdict have been prepared for your use. You will take these forms to the jury room. When you have reached a unanimous agreement as to your verdict, the foreperson will sign the forms which express your verdict. You will then return all forms of verdict, these instructions, and any exhibits to the courtroom. There are 12 that deliberate. There are 4 alternates on this jury, given the long length of this jury. Keeping with the privacy, I'm going to pass this instruction down with the help of Ryan. You're going to look if this is one of your names, and you are one of the alternates. What I'm going to ask the bailiffs to do is to first take the alternates out so they can get their belongings, and I'm going to ask you to meet me down at the end of the hallway to explain. I hate to tell alternates they're alternates because they've been paying so close to the evidence, and so just to talk with you, and then and thank you, and then right along on your right on your clip will be the jurors themselves, okay? And the jurors will go into the room, so I'll need the aid of both of them. But first, let me pass this piece of paper over to you. Look down here. There's 4 names. See if one of them is yours and you're an alternate. It's at the bottom. All right, so follow the alternates follow Ryan. I'll meet you down at the end of the hallway after you get your belongings, and then you'll follow with the jury.
All rise.
All right, we're in recess. I'll be back in, but we're in recess. You can get going with your exhibits and things like that.